Good evening, friends. On behalf of the local spiritual assembly of the Baha'is of the Gold Coast City, we extend a very warm welcome to each and every one of you present here this evening for tonight's presentation on the greatest holy leaf. I also extend the assembly's deepest gratitude to our eminent presenter, Dr. Janet Khan, for accepting our invitation to be with us this evening and share this presentation with our community. Dr. Khan, as a community, we remember with great fondness the time nearly 4 years ago when we had you in our community, along with your beloved late husband and our dearly loved and cherished former member of the Universal House of Justice, Dr. Peter Khan. And tonight, once again, it's our privilege and honor to have you with us again this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight's talk is about the greatest holy leaf. The greatest holy leaf, Bahiyyih Khanum, was the second child and first daughter of Baha'u'llah and his wife, Bahiyyih Khanum. Beloved by the Baha'is, she was regarded as one of the greatest women to have ever lived, and in the Guardian's words, his competent deputy, his representative and vice-regent, with none to equal her. The talk will examine her extraordinary life and legacy and her significant contribution to both the administrative structures of the Baha'i faith and its emergence as a worldwide community. Reflection on her outstanding qualities and the legacy of her life presents an inspiring model to all thoughtful women and men who seek a model and see creative ways to deal with social change and the pressures of contemporary life. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce our speaker this evening, Dr. Janet Khan. Dr. Janet Khan always requests that we keep her introductions short, which is somewhat difficult for someone who is so accomplished. Dr. Khan holds a PhD in education counseling from the University of Michigan and a BA in psychology from Sydney University. From 1976 to 1983, she was involved in the program in counseling psychology at the University of Queensland. Prior to this appointment, she worked for 6 years as a counselor and program specialist at the University of Michigan's Center for Continuing Education of Women. During her time in Australia, she served for 6 years as member of the National Spiritual Assembly of Australia and as its chair from 1982 to 1983. From 1983 until 2010, Dr. Khan served in the research department at the Baha'i World Centre. Her research interests include gender issues, the role of women in religion, and aspects of social change and the evolution of the Baha'i system of governance. Dr. Khan has many publications to her credit, and these include The Prophet's Daughter, The Life and Legacy of Bahiyyih Khanum, Outstanding Heroine of the Baha'i Faith, published in 2005. Heritage of Light, The Spiritual Destiny of America, published in 2009, and The Advancement of Women, A Baha'i Perspective, which was co-authored with her late husband, Peter J. Khan, in 2003. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our presenter for tonight, one who has been serving the faith and the greater community with distinction as an educator, a researcher, an author, and an all-round exemplary woman. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Janat Khan.
Good evening, dear friends. It's a great pleasure to be back at in the Gold Coast. I guess it's quite a while since I was here last, and the occasion to which our chair referred, the evening when Peter was here about just a little under 4 years, a bit over 4 years ago now, was really a very special occasion. It was really the last public talk that he gave before he passed away, and he was talking about the 5-year plan with such energy and such intelligence that he kind of carried us all forward and made us really aware of the processes and the activities that we've all been now engaged in for the last 4 years in the implementation of that plan. And so my subject tonight is quite different, but I hope it will contribute to the energy that will enable us to finish this 5-year plan with great victory and great vigour. Tonight, as the chair said, I want to reflect on aspects of the life of Bahiyyih Khanum, the daughter of the manifestation of God, Baha'u'llah, and his wife, Bahiyyih Khanum, who we also know as Nawab. She was born in 1846 in Persia and died in July 1932 in Haifa at the age of 86. So she lived a long life, a life which spanned the heroic early days of the faith, where there were martyrs and great persecutions of the faith, through to the time of the establishment, the beginning of the systematic worldwide establishment of the administrative order of the faith, the formative age of the faith. She was given the title, the greatest holy leaf, by her father. And it's interesting that he gave her this title after the death of her mother. Nawab Bahiyyih Khanum also had the title, the most exalted leaf. And with her passing in 1886, Baha'u'llah bestowed this same title on his beloved daughter, Bahiyyih Khanum. In thinking about Bahiyyih Khanum this evening, I'll refer somewhat to the events in her life, but I also want to raise the question about the significance of her life. Why we should give attention to studying the life of this woman who died, after all, over 80 years ago, 83 years ago. Why do we study the life of this woman? She's really an interesting person. If you put aside the religious connotations and put her into the period of history when she was living and the social and cultural context in which she grew up, she's a fascinating woman. She is really a fascinating woman. And I want to encourage you to think about how interesting a person she was. She lived in the Middle East under conditions in which women had few opportunities. Yet she overcame the suffocating effects of the environment in which she grew up. It was a background full of limitations. It was a culture that was notorious for its blind fanaticism, its narrow outlook, and its uncompromising refusal to accommodate to the forces of modernity. So it was a very conservative, backward culture. And yet she was able to rise above this. This is really interesting. It's hard to rise above one's culture. Her life was one of imprisonment and captivity. And this lasted for 56 years of her life. It started when she was about 6 and ended when she was 62. And yet, she demonstrated the qualities of a liberated person. She wasn't a victim. But she, despite these challenges, despite the imprisonment, the house arrest and whatever, she was a liberated person. She was a modern person. She's also, I think, very interesting because she played a unique role as the designated head of an independent world religion, the Baha'i faith. And she did this, it was a brief period of time, but it was at a critical point in the history of the faith. Beyond all of that, her father, Baha'u'llah, elevated her to a station and a rank that was quite unique. Let me just read to you how Baha'u'llah refers to her. This is a tablet in which he addresses his daughter, and he says, "We have elevated thee to the rank of one of the most distinguished among thy sex, and granted thee in my court a station such as none other woman hath surpassed." So she was unique. She was outstanding. She was the outstanding woman of the Baha'i dispensation, attested to by none other than Baha'u'llah. Now, to really appreciate what she did and her contribution, it's useful to think about what the world was like in the middle of the 19th century in Iran, in the Middle East. At that time, women tended to be largely invisible. They had no real role in society, and they were locked up inside of their homes and had very few opportunities to have any interactions with men unless the men were members of their family. There are reports of individuals, mostly Westerners, who visited Iran, visited Persia in those years, and they commented on the situation of women. They commented on such things as the monotony of women's lives, the lack of intellectual stimulus, and the constraints on their movements, both physical in terms, I think, of being wrapped up in the veil, and also psychological in terms of the lack of opportunities for education and access to social and cultural development. In the first 2 decades of the 20th century, in the early 1920s, there are reports to the effect that about 3% of women in Persia, only 3%, were able to read and write. Now, it's clear that women of the upper classes had more educational opportunities. They learned to read, they learned to write, they studied the Quran, they studied poetry and calligraphy, and had certain kinds of opportunities. But the general mass of the population of women were uneducated. One of the challenges of describing the lives of individual women at that time is really the lack of historical sources. Because women tended to be regarded as, I don't know how to say it, but they weren't regarded as having a real role in society, especially a role outside of the home. What kind of contribution could they make? So the tendency was to discount any contribution that women could make. The other thing was that even when women did do wonderful things, and certainly they did, their exploits tended not to be recorded. And this, in large part, because the historians who were recording what was happening were men. And the culture made it inappropriate for men to inquire into the activities and the lives of women, even to inquire about the name of somebody's wife would have been very discourteous and something that wasn't at all appropriate to do. So the challenge was to obtain information about the activities of women during that period of time. Now, that was the situation in very broad terms that existed in the culture. Now, contrary to that, we find Baha'u'llah, we find Abdu'l-Baha, we find Shoghi Effendi writing about the greatest holy leaf. Shoghi Effendi mentions that Baha'u'llah withdrew the veil of concealment from his daughter. And that's such an interesting term to me, taking like she was hidden behind the veil. And Shoghi Effendi says that Baha'u'llah removed this veil, took the veil of concealment from her and talked about her, made her visible. Not only did he mention her in his tablets and address her in his tablets, but he gave her assignments, special assignments to undertake on his behalf, on behalf of the faith. So clearly he saw her capacity, he saw her ability, and he used that capacity for the benefit of promoting the interests of the faith. With Bahiyyih Khanum, it seems like with the passage of years, she became gradually, more and more of a public figure. And I'll explain that in a little while. But she emerges as a person in the eyes of the Baha'i community. She is given responsibilities that are more and more public and more weighty and important. Another way of gaining information about what Bahiyyih Khanum did is to reread the history of the faith. Take out God Passes By and reread the history. And alongside the history of the faith that Shoghi Effendi wrote, take the letters that Shoghi Effendi wrote to the Baha'i world at the time that Bahiyyih Khanum passed away in 1932. And the reason I suggest that these two things be read together is that in these letters, Shoghi Effendi alludes to the significance of the qualities that Bahiyyih Khanum manifested and the actions that she took at different phases in the history of the faith. So I found it so interesting to put these two together, because by doing that, you can reinsert, if you will, Bahiyyih Khanum into the unfoldment of the history of the faith. Okay, so let's now look at some of the aspects of her life. If we think about the unfoldment of her life, we don't know very much about the early years, her childhood. We have glimpses of what was happening when Baha'u'llah was imprisoned in the Sia Chal. These glimpses come to us both from God Passes By and also from The Chosen Highway, where Lady Blomfield interviewed, if you will, Bahiyyih Khanum and talked to her about the early days, her recollections of the early days of the faith. So we know from her childhood that she shared in the sufferings of Baha'u'llah from the earliest days. And it also seems that she had a good understanding of the station of Baha'u'llah. She shared the exiles of Baha'u'llah, his banishments and imprisonments. And as I mentioned before, she was 6 years old when this process of exile began. And leaving Persia at the age of 6, she was never to return. It was never possible for her to go. So at age 6, exiled first to Baghdad, then to Istanbul, and then to Adrianople, and then to the Holy Land, never the opportunity of returning. When she was in her young teenage years in Baghdad, Baha'u'llah, and it was at a time when there was disunity caused by Baha'u'llah's half-brother, and there was a lot of kind of tensions and all within the community. Baha'u'llah at this time sent her, he entrusted is the word that Shoghi Effendi uses, he entrusted her with delicate missions. He called upon this young daughter to undertake certain functions, certain missions on his behalf to further the interests of the faith. Now, okay, everybody says, what were they? We don't know. We don't have a record. We don't have a record. We can speculate, but we don't know for sure. What we do know is how Shoghi Effendi described these missions. Okay, let me just find this page. Yeah, here we go. Shoghi Effendi writes, and when at a later time this revered and precious member of the Holy Family, then in her teens, came to be entrusted by the guiding hand of her father with missions that no girl of her age could or would be willing to perform. So they're challenging things that were difficult, that nobody would probably willingly take on. And yet Baha'u'llah entrusted her. He gave her the responsibility to undertake these assignments. And then further, the Guardian says, the delicacy and extreme gravity of such functions, as she from time to time was called upon to fulfill. And then it goes on further and further and further. But they were delicate. They weren't all the time, but they were from time to time. They were delicate and challenging, and things that Baha'u'llah really wanted done. The next phase in the exiles was really the main in Adrianople. And there again, there was the split between Mirza Yahya, between Baha'u'llah and Mirza Yahya. And Shoghi Effendi describes how she acted in that situation. He doesn't describe what went on, who did what and who said what, but rather he describes how she acted. And, okay. He said, she stood as a soaring pillar. Everything else was sort of shaky and people were at each other's throats and who knows what. But there she was, standing like a soaring pillar, immovable and fixed. She didn't waver. She was firm. She understood. And he describes some of her actions. He says, in captivating hearts and winning over souls, in destroying doubts and misgivings, she led the field. So her personal qualities, the ability to understand, the ability to communicate, the ability to increase somebody's understanding and knowledge of the covenant, the straight path, the way forward. With the waters of her countless mercies, she brought thorny hearts to a blossoming of love from the all-glorious, and with the influence of her pure, loving kindness, transformed the implacable, the unyielding, into impassioned lovers of the celestial beauty's peerless cause. Okay, it's beautiful poetic language, but if you think about what's being communicated by that elevated, flowery language, you see the actions of this very grounded, intelligent, loving, well-informed woman who was able to be a force for unity and helping people to really understand the true nature of the teachings of the cause. So she's amazing. She's really an amazing person. Okay, after the passing of Baha'u'llah, she was the major support for Abdu'l-Baha. She was the head of his household, she supported him, she encouraged him. She was the one who accompanied him on his visits to many of the dignitaries. She would talk to the women, he would talk to the government officials. When it was time for Abdu'l-Baha to embark on his travels to the West, she was the one to whom he gave the responsibility of taking care of business in his absence. She, as in the introduction, the chair mentioned that she was described as Abdu'l-Baha's competent deputy, representative, and vicegerent during his travels in the West. So she wasn't just a figurehead. She was Abdu'l-Baha's competent deputy, his representative, especially his representative in relation to things administrative. So it's really important to look at the words and to consider the significance of the words that are chosen to describe her actions and to describe her qualities. There are some fascinating insights into how she functioned in Abdu'l-Baha's absence, and really in how Abdu'l-Baha relied on her to take care of business in his absence. It seems like Abdu'l-Baha he needed good information in his absence. And the person that he really could trust to get the facts was Bahiyyih Khanum. And so we find this letter that he wrote to her from New York. And he writes to his sister, I arrived in New York in the best of health and have been at all times thinking of thee. No, he's missing his sister. He loved his sister. And supplicating fervently at the threshold of the Blessed Beauty that he may guard thee in the stronghold of his protection. So this loving brother communicating with his sister. And he tells her the utmost fellowship and joy, and I hope that thou art sheltered under his bountiful care. Now, here comes the business. Write to me at once about Ruha Khanum's and Shoghi Effendi's condition. So obviously they'd been unwell or there was some issue associated with, and he wanted the facts. He didn't want just a general kind of impression about, oh, yes, everything is fine. But he wanted to know their condition. Informing me fully, he says, and hiding nothing. This is the best way. So he wanted the facts. He relied upon her to give him the kind of information that was needed. There's another sweet letter that he wrote also on his travels in the West, and he'd been very moved by the response to his talks and his travels, and he wanted to express gratitude to God for the wonders, all these wonderful things that were happening. And so it's clear that he thought the best way to do this would be to engage his sister, to go on his behalf to the shrines and to pray there, a prayer of gratitude for these victories that were coming to the faith. He not only asked her to do it, but he gave her the prayer. He wrote the words that he wanted her to say when she entered the shrine. And it's very sweet. I won't read it to you, but I'll just tantalize you with it. But it says something about the nature of the relationship between, it was not only brother and sister, but there was an administrative component. Abdu'l-Baha was asking Bahiyyih Khanum to undertake certain administrative and other kinds of functions on his behalf in service to the faith. Okay. The period of time where she makes an enormous contribution to the faith is after the passing of Abdu'l-Baha. And I know some of you have been working on Book 8, Ruhi Book 8, and so you're probably familiar with some of the things that Bahiyyih Khanum had the bounty of doing at that period of time. But I just want to highlight a few of these. Okay, what she was called upon to do was to assume a position of great significance and importance. When Abdu'l-Baha passed away, the person he'd appointed as his successor was a student in England. He was 24 years of age and in England. Bahiyyih Khanum, and he didn't know that he was the person who was appointed to be the successor. With the passing of Abdu'l-Baha, it seems like Bahiyyih Khanum had custody of the will. Somehow, toward the end, she had the will, Abdu'l-Baha's will. And the will was opened to see whether Abdu'l-Baha had left any instructions concerning where he should be buried. There was no instruction, it was closed up, but it was Bahiyyih Khanum who kind of took hold of the situation. She was the one who announced the passing of Abdu'l-Baha. She was the one who communicated with the Baha'i world, ensuring them that provisions had been made for the faith following the passing of Abdu'l-Baha. And when Shoghi Effendi returned to the Holy Land and was able to read the will, it was Bahiyyih Khanum who announced the appointment of Shoghi Effendi. Shoghi Effendi felt, it seemed, that he needed some time to prepare himself for this responsibility that had been placed on his shoulders, and decided that in April of 1922, which was about 5 months after the passing of Abdu'l-Baha, that he would remove himself and go and spend some time in Europe, namely largely in Switzerland, in order to prepare himself spiritually for this responsibility. But before leaving, he made provisions for the management and the organisation of the faith in his absence. And what did he do? He turned to his great aunt, Bahiyyih Khanum, along with some other members of the Holy Family, and entrusted the faith, the organisation of the faith, to the supervision of the members of the Holy Family under the headship, and he used that word, headship, of the Greatest Holy Leave. Bahiyyih Khanum was 76 years of age at that point. So this elderly woman who was grief-stricken at the passing of her beloved brother found herself holding in her hands this great responsibility. Now, I want to emphasize that she was not, it was not simply a ceremonial position that she was given, and nor was her authority only confined to administering the affairs of women, like in a convent, but it was a general kind of mandate. And so she was not a mere figurehead. It was a real job. It was a real job. Now, to show you how real this job was, before Shoghi Effendi left the Holy Land, he wrote to the representatives of the government in Palestine, explaining to them what provisions he'd made for the administration of the faith in his absence. And so he writes to the administrators, "As I'm compelled to leave Haifa for reasons of health, I have named as my representative during my absence the sister of Abdul Baha, Bahiyyih Khanum." So he names her. He puts her out there in the public. See, it's becoming more and more public. The letter goes on to explain to the authorities, the government authorities, that Shoghi Effendi had appointed a committee to assist her to conduct the affairs of the Baha'i movement in this country and elsewhere. So it wasn't just in Haifa, the little area around Haifa, maybe Akka as well, but there and elsewhere. So it was a broad mandate. And what I think is even more fascinating is that Shoghi Effendi made it clear that the committee chairman's authority to act was dependent on the written endorsement of Bahiyyih Khanum. So she had to sign off on letters that went out and approve any decisions, that the committee may have made. So it was a very significant responsibility that she was given. I think it's really unique in the history of religion that a woman be given the responsibility to, if you will, lead a religion, an independent world religion, for a period of time. Now, yes, it was for an interim period, and the responsibility was extended to the period of extended absences of Shoghi Effendi from the Holy Land between the years 1922 and 1924. But it's interesting to note also that the first of these absences that began in 1922 lasted for about 8 months. And that's a long period of time. In the years after that, 23 and 24, the absences were not so long, but the responsibilities were the same. Now, what did she do? What was the functions that were performed during the absences of the guardian? Again, as in the absences of Abdul Baha, she was, I think, like the designated point of authority. She was the person that the Baha'i world wrote to in the Holy Land for information or for guidance or whatever. She was really the main channel of communication. She was the source of reliable information and guidance to the Baha'i community. She was the one who said, that Shoghi Effendi has now left. We're expecting him back, such and such. So she kept the Baha'i world informed about what was happening. So you could see a community would feel secure, would feel comfortable, because they could see that things were moving forward, they knew what was happening. The other thing that you see when you look at her correspondence, and she wrote lots of letters during this period, she really began the process of educating the community about the contents of Abdul Baha's will, the will and testament. So she reminded people, yes, there's a centre to which everybody turns. The centre is Shoghi Effendi. And then she would explain the reasons and the importance of having a centre of authority. So she performed an educational function. She encouraged the communities to begin establishing spiritual assemblies, which had also been a focus of the Will and Testament. And she I think she began to train the community in administrative functioning. And if you look at her letters, they were very administrative. They were very loving, but they were clear. You knew what you had to do. They were encouraging. There was guidance. And she was like a link between the time of Abdu'l-Baha and the period at the beginning, the very beginning of the formative age, where the assemblies, where people were having to get used to the existence of spiritual assemblies and accepting guidance from spiritual assemblies instead of from one charismatic person. So she kind of made this linkage, made this connection between one period of the faith to the other, and she kept it on a stable footing. The other thing she did was she encouraged individuals. I think she empowered individuals. They'd write to her, they were feeling really depressed because Abdu'l-Baha had passed away, and she'd empathise with them, and she'd share her feelings. Like, I know what it's like, sort of thing. But she did it in eloquent language, and she reassured them that although he was not physically present, his spirit was still in the world. We had his guidance. He'd trained us to perform many of the functions that were needed. So now, now we can move forward. So she helped, I think she also helped the community begin to adjust to the changes that were called for with the passing of Abdu'l-Baha and the guidance that came with his will and testament. It was a new day, required new actions, new behaviour, a new way of doing things, while retaining the spirit that existed in the time of Baha'u'llah and the time of Abdu'l-Baha. So it was a really critical function that she performed. When Shoghi Effendi returned to the Holy Land in 1924, Bahiyyih Khanum was in the 79th year of her life. She did this from the age of about 76 through to 79. She didn't say, I'm too old, I don't have a master's degree in business administration or this or that or the other, but she just did it. She took in her hands with joy the opportunities that presented themselves. One of the things that in her very old age, she was a great support to Shoghi Effendi, really a great support to Shoghi Effendi. She encouraged him. If you read some of his letters, they're really heartbreaking. In one of them, he says that when he was feeling like it was almost too much. I mean, they're my words, they're not his words. She encouraged him. He thought about the sacrifices that she'd made. He thought about the services that she performed. He thought about the sufferings that she'd endured in the course of her life, and it energised him, picked him up, and on he went. She, in old age, had a very, while she was, had clear memories of the past and the early history of the faith, she also had a very deep interest in the progress of the faith. So she didn't just live in the past, but she retained to the very end of her life interest in the progress of the faith. And I'm sure some of you are familiar with the story that that is recounted by one of the last Western pilgrims who met Bahiyyih Khanum really in the last couple of months of her life. And this pilgrim was on her way to Persia to undertake some responsibilities on behalf of the Guardian. And before leaving, she had this meeting with Bahiyyih Khanum, and Bahiyyih Khanum was aware that Keith Ransom Kaler was the teacher who was on her way to Iran. And Bahiyyih Khanum was aware that she was headed for Iran. And in really her last comments to Keith Ransom Kaler was to ask her, when she was in Tehran, to pray on her behalf. So she wanted Keith Ransom Kaler to pray on her behalf, on behalf of the greatest holy leaf. And she asked her not only that, but when she was there to greet the Baha'is, the men and the women, and to convey to them all her greetings. So this was really one of the last wishes. And I think it shows her the interest to the very end of her life in the progress of the faith and in the concern for the unfoldment of the work of the cause. I want to now change pace and answer the question, what was she like? I just wish I knew firsthand. It'd be wonderful to have had the opportunity to meet her. But I'd like to share with you a number of pen portraits that were left by people who had the privilege of meeting her. Now, the ones I have three. They're fairly brief, but they were written by Western Baha'i women who mostly had the opportunity of meeting her when she was quite elderly. The first one was, I figure, she must have been about in the mid-50s, her mid-50s at the time, and that's the earliest one I have. The other two, I think, are much later. But the first one, the woman who was among the first of the group of Western Baha'i pilgrims who visited Abdu'l-Baha around the turn of the 20th century. Yeah. Anyway, 20th century? 20th, anyway, you know what I mean. Okay. So she leaves this impression. She writes, "Her personality is indelibly imprinted upon my memory. Tall, slender, and of noble bearing. Her body gave the impression of perfect poise between energy and tranquility." Just think of it. A body poised between energy and tranquility. Between wiry endurance, she was tough, and inward composure. Again, the juxtaposition of contrasts. Imparting to the beholder a sense of security, comfort, and reliance, impossible to describe. So that was how she impacted this pilgrim. And then the pilgrim goes on to describe her face. She focuses in now and says, "Her beautiful face was the feminine counterpart of Abdu'l-Baha's. The lines of suffering and privation softened by the patient sweetness of the mouth. The dominating brow, bespeaking intellect and will. So she had a brain, intellect and will, and she knew what she wanted. She wasn't a pushover. She couldn't walk all over. And this dominating brow, bespeaking intellect and will, was lighted by the wonderful, understanding eyes. So again, you've got this beauty. Watching, and then the pilgrim who's giving this report focuses in on the eyes. Much better than a photo. Watching their expressive changes. At one moment they darkened with sympathy or pain. The next moment sparkled with laughter and humour. So she was alive. She was a real person. She was complex. Interesting. And this only served to deepen the impression of her irresistible spiritual attraction. Okay, I've got two more. And these are toward really in the evening of her life, when she was quite aged. And I think it seems in reading this that what the pilgrim was doing was deriving deep lessons from observing the ways in which Bahiyyih Khanum interacted with others, and also about her general attitude toward life. And so this was the observation. Her life could not be called martyrdom, for she didn't recognize it as such. She didn't recognize her life as martyrdom. Yes, it was hard, it was difficult, there was imprisonment, there was suffering, there was, all these things. But she wasn't a victim. And goes on. She was not shaken by the transports of rapture of the martyr, and has no urge to raise the banner, to rush to encounter, to offer up with heroic valour. So she wasn't emotional, just rushing in without thinking. Her ardour burned with a steady flame, this groundedness, this sort of deepness in the faith, this firmness in the covenant, all these sorts of things. In the face of test and danger, she neither hurried nor held back, but entered the perilous way with quiet breath. Isn't that wonderful? Really wonderful. Her courage was born of her understanding faith, and it was this faith, this understanding, that carried her serene through years of incessant labour and meticulous service, and through times of waiting empty-handed, and through the bearing of irremediable sorrow and loss. And finally, just one more. Again, drawing lessons from life. Her balance, sense of fineness and fitness, and practical judgment she displayed in creating order and grace in the household. She did ordinary things as well. I mean, she was the head of Abdu'l-Baha's household. There are stories about her in the kitchen, being observed in the kitchen, carving up the carcass of a lamb that had just been freshly slaughtered and chopping off a bit, this will be for dinner, this will be for the distribution from the poor, we'll save this and it can be used for soup and who knows what. But she was practical. She knew how to do practical things. So she didn't live in a rarefied atmosphere, but she cooked with gas. Okay. All the elements that make for well-being, she blended in an ambience of harmony. Her strong will, so here again, her will, she had a strong will, was never used to override, and her decided opinions were never pressed upon another. Her ways were gentle. Others might break the shell with a blow. It was for her to unsheath the kernel with infinite care and skill. In her, you met with no exactions, no biddance. She beckoned, smiling, and would have no one come heavy-footed or bent to her will. So she nurtured, she encouraged, she accompanied, rather than harangued and got after and made people feel uncomfortable and guilty. She didn't do that. So quietly did she make her influence felt that you were scarcely conscious of its working. Okay. See what I mean? She is such an interesting person. She is really such an interesting person. Her contributions were outstanding. She was a participant in the early history of the faith. She was right there she observed martyrdoms. I mean, she was there. She saw it right from the beginning. She participated in each phase in a way that was appropriate to the needs of the time. And in the course of her lifetime, she emerged more and more into the realm of the public, doing things. I mean, not that you have to do things in public in order to be recognised, but I think it's a lesson in how the faith upholds and encourages and has developed the participation of women, not only in the West and in other countries, but especially in countries where women haven't had the opportunity and need more empowerment and encouragement. So we see this, we see the commitment of Baha'u'llah to this, we see the commitment of Abdu'l-Baha, we see the confidence that the central figures of the faith have in the capacity of women to serve the cause. And I think the other thing, we see the encouragement and really kind of the safety nets that were provided by Baha'u'llah for his daughter, for Abdu'l-Baha, and his sister, Shoghi Effendi, and his great aunt, in order to enable her to undertake many of the functions that she had to perform. I'd like to just close with one other statement about who she was, who she is, at this time referring to the words of Shoghi Effendi, where he talks about her qualities and he relates it to heroism. And I'm sure you know that Shoghi Effendi described her as the outstanding heroine of the Baha'i dispensation. And so I think it's interesting to see this description that might give us new thoughts about what heroism is and what heroism can be. Okay, now let me just find the right page here. Yes. And this is, again, from one of these letters that Shoghi Effendi wrote at the time of the passing of Bahiyyih Khanum. He says, "It would take me too long to make even a brief allusion to those incidents of her life, each of which eloquently proclaims her as a daughter worthy to inherit that priceless heritage bequeathed to her by Baha'u'llah." And now he starts listing her qualities. "A purity of life that reflected itself in even the minutest details of her daily occupations and activities. A tenderness of heart that obliterated every distinction of creed, class, and colour. She wasn't prejudiced. A resignation and serenity that evoked to the mind the calm and heroic fortitude of the Bab. A natural fondness of flowers and children that was so characteristic of Baha'u'llah. Did you know that Baha'u'llah loved flowers and children? This was one of the characteristics of Baha'u'llah and also of Bahiyyih Khanum. An extreme sociability which made her accessible to all. She wasn't standoffish, but she was there. She was out there. She was with the friends. A generosity, a love at once disinterested and undiscriminating that reflected so clearly the attributes of Abdu'l-Baha's character. A sweetness of temper, a cheerfulness that no amount of sorrow could becloud, a quiet and unassuming disposition that served to enhance 1,000-fold the prestige of her exalted rank, a forgiving nature that instantly disarmed the most unyielding enemy. These rank among the outstanding attributes of a saintly life, which history will acknowledge as having been endowed with a celestial potency that few of the heroes of the past possessed. Each one of these attributes could be the subject of lots of reflection and discussion. You know, how do they apply? And what does it mean, this, that, and the other? What does that look like in our lives? How would we, if we were this, do this, this, and this? So there's much to ponder. Thank you. I think I'll stop there. There's an allusion to that in one of Shoghi Effendi's letters. I can find it for you if I take a bit of effort, and I think this is relevant because one of the things that one way in which Shoghi Effendi refers to the greatest holy Alif, he refers to her as the archetype of the people of Baha. And an archetype in broad terms is like a model. And it's important to realise that she's not the perfect exemplar, because that's the function of Abdu'l-Baha. But when you look closely at these letters, the letters of the Guardian, he calls attention to the example of her qualities. And I'm sort of running with your question, but I'm making another point. So we don't, she didn't marry, she didn't have the opportunity for very much education, and there are a number of things that if we thought about it, she didn't do. And so I think I'm just making the point that there's a difference between Abdu'l-Baha being the perfect exemplar and Bahiyyih Khanum being an archetype in terms of her qualities and character, being a model and example to the members of the Baha'i community, both women and men. So, but I'll look for that I'll look for the reference in the letters here and see if I can find it for you. One of the things I tried to do in writing the book about her was to be careful to try and find a text for the things that I wrote about. So, clearly it's my understanding of the text, but I didn't want to create a myth about her, because I think that's not the way to go, to have sort of magical thinking about the greatest holy leaf, but to really confine the comments about her to things that are based on texts and things that were reliable. Yeah. In 1982, at the time of the 50th anniversary of her passing, this compilation was prepared at the World Centre. It's called Bahiyyih Khanum, the Greatest Holy Leaf. And it consists of extracts from tablets of Baha'u'llah, about her, Abdu'l-Baha's comments about her and letters to her, and a lot of letters written by and on behalf of Shoghi Effendi. The last section of the book consists of letters of the Greatest Holy Leaf, and these the fifth section. So this whole, that much, about half of the book, and they're very interesting. They're very strategic. I mean, in some ways they remind me of the letters of the tablets of Abdu'l-Baha, in that there's that same spirit, but some of them are also different. There was a period in the early 1920s, I don't know what year it was, maybe 23, 24, where there was a rise in persecutions again in Iran. And she wrote to the Baha'is throughout the world, the few national assemblies that there were, as well as groups in the different countries where Baha'is existed. And she gave instructions about how to handle this crisis. And there were two prongs. One was to approach the government in the country where the Baha'is were living and ask them to raise the matter with the Persian ambassador, if there was one in the particular country. And the second prong was to go directly to, can't remember what the other one was, but there were two prongs. And not only did she say, do this and do this, but she then set out what to put in the letters. Tell them this, tell them that. And they are just fascinating to read, because it's so much like a lot of the strategies that have been used in external affair work in more recent times for the defence of the Baha'is in Iran. And so, and some of the letters were, the ideas, the points to be made were very straightforward. Like, tell them this, say to them this, tell them that we uphold government, that we're obedient to government. And so you can learn a lot about her approach, her strategies, the way she thought. She was an interesting thinker. I think it's probably out of print, but it's accessible. You can get the content through Baha'i books. Yeah. There are two things. There are things about her relevance to the world. And then there's a second question about how an understanding of Bahiyyih Khanum can help men to promote the advancement of women. And in relation to the first, I think to me, she's somebody who is able to adjust to change, to recognise that new situations require different responses, and to do this in a principled way. So I think that's one. I think that's something. I mean, the world is changing so quickly, and often the response to change is to dig your toes in and hope that it all goes away. But it doesn't, and one has to find a way of dealing with change and with modernity and with positive things and with negative things. So I think that's one thing. I think the other thing about her is that she was willing to take on administrative responsibilities. And if you look at the world around, everybody's running from politics, everybody's running from having to accept any responsibility, any commitment, either that or they're on an ego trip. And so I think there are things that can be learned by looking at her life to see. I mean, she was a person of high rank. Baha'u'llah gave her this special rank, and yet she acted in a way that didn't lead to separation and disunity. And so she shows how rank can be a positive force within societies, and there is rank within societies. She was resilient. She picked herself up, she dusted herself off, and she got on with it. And that, I think, is and she was able to find meaning in very difficult life situations. And I think, you know, many of us in this day and age are confronted by very challenging life situations, and there are things to be learned, I think, from how she responded. Even just if it's just inspiration to kind of, okay, well, I can do this sort of thing. In relation to the second part of it, what men can do, Abdu'l-Baha answers that question. His answer is that if men own the equality of women, the problem would be solved. So if men can really accept that men and women are equal, and to provide encouragement and support, then and to raise children so that neither son nor daughter feels absolutely entitled. I mean, there are things that can be done, but I think everything needs to be done in a way that's constructive. Because if things are not done in a constructive way, it creates a lot of disunity. And I think it slows down progress. But I think the work in the Baha'i community, with the study circles, with serving together in different capacities, we have a chance to encourage each other, to accompany each other, and to engage in processes that are very constructive. Now, in terms of how you communicate that in discourse, then I think you have to know the context, you have to know the culture, you have to be wise to choose what to emphasize, what not to emphasize. You can't do it all at once, so it'll be a process. Thank you.